A disturbing analysis on homelessness.
Shocking rise in homelessness.
Oregon has the second highest rate of unsheltered homelessness nationwide.
The problem has worsened, and the number of people experiencing homelessness has grown year over year.
The United States is supposedly a wealthy country. Despite this wealth, it has generally failed to deliver to the masses the freedom and pursuit of happiness promised in its founding scriptures. But isn't the US the richest country on Earth? Can a nation truly be considered rich when hundreds of thousands of its own citizens are sleeping on the street? In this video, we'll analyze the housing crisis in the US, what's causing it, why it's getting worse, and how it's driving Americans into poverty. If you enjoy what we do, then don't forget to like the video, and check out our Patreon for exclusive content and early releases. Okay, obviously, the US didn't invent homelessness or poverty. They've been around more or less since the dawn of civilization. But in more modern times, owning property has granted immense power. Take the early United States, for example. Owning property was so valued and so tied to morality that being homeless was illegal. Now, if you go looking for a law that compels homeownership or explicitly says being homeless is illegal, you won't find one. Since the 16th century, being unhoused has been criminalized under the euphemism vagrancy. In a 2019 paper, Risa Goluboff, professor of history and law at the University of Virginia, discusses the history of vagrancy laws and describes them as, quote, generally making it a crime to be poor, idle, dissolute, immoral, drunk, lewd, or suspicious. Goluboff bluntly and concisely explains the purpose of these laws, saying, quote, they served as a ubiquitous tool for maintaining hierarchy and order in American society. Since this hierarchy and order in the United States is dictated by liberalism and capitalism, these laws ultimately benefit the rich and the ruling class. Industrialization accelerated in the 1820s and 1830s, causing a mass migration from the farms to the cities. People began to work for wages instead of farming or working a trade, and therefore became entirely dependent on the capitalist aristocracy. President and unapologetic war criminal Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, marking the first federal legislation that directly caused mass homelessness. By the 1850s, police stations served as a makeshift, often violent and inhumane shelter system. You might be surprised to learn that until the 1870s, the term homelessness didn't exist. It was coined during a tumultuous time in the United States. The slaves, freed without any support or compensation, were being subjected to the early prison industrial complex. The National Railroad system was being constructed, and the nation was suffering the worst economic depression in US history. In fact, this period was called the Great Depression prior to the one we think of today, and there's ongoing debate about which was worse. This prequel Great Depression was responsible for 20% of the total US population losing their homes. If that were to happen today, 66.8 million people would be unhoused. That's roughly the total population of California and Texas. The Great Depression of the 1930s and natural disasters like the Dust Bowl led to the next major explosion in the unhoused population. Liberals tend to give too much credit to the New Deal under the Roosevelt regime. However, many, if not all, of the programs facilitated systemic racism, which severely held back the success of the legislation. For now, we'll focus on the National Housing Act, which created the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA. Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law, says the FHA is a state-sponsored system of discrimination that was primarily designed to provide housing to white, middle-class, and lower-middle-class families. The US government created and incentivized the system known as redlining, which the Texas Homeless Network correctly observes paved the way for African Americans' overrepresentation in homeless populations today. These programs created vast wealth, mostly for white families, through the 60s. Unfortunately, housing discrimination wouldn't become illegal, on paper and weakly enforced, until 1968 with the Fair Housing Act. The 1950s also bore witness to one of the most cruel and overlooked policy decisions in US history: deinstitutionalization, or moving from centralized and often isolated mental health care institutions to a community-based model. Due to the incentives created in the US for-profit healthcare system, an ignorant medical establishment, and a bigoted public, thousands of patients ended up unhoused and without resources. The process of deinstitutionalization was painfully slow, lasting until the 1970s. Despite these challenges, a movement against the vagrancy regime scored a major victory when in 1972 the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Papa Christou versus City of Jacksonville, in which 8 defendants were convicted in Florida for violating a Jacksonville vagrancy ordinance. Justice Douglas stated in the judgment that the ordinance was void for vagueness, because it fails to give a person of ordinary intelligence fair notice that his contemplated conduct is forbidden by the statute, it encourages arbitrary and erratic arrests and convictions, it makes criminal activities that are normally innocent, and it places almost unfettered discretion in the hands of the police. Much of the more modern epidemic of homelessness started in the late 70s and early 80s. The Reagan administration infamously ignored the largest public health crisis in living memory, the HIV and AIDS pandemic. As a result of the lack of federal support, many suffering from HIV and AIDS became homeless before succumbing to the disease. The 1970s and 80s saw a flood of neoliberal policies that shaped the modern homelessness epidemic we experience today. Now, we can't talk about homelessness without mentioning the war on drugs, started by Richard Nixon and carried forward by every US president since. John Ehrlichman, assistant to the president for domestic affairs under Nixon, did not mince words when he later confessed, "The Nixon White House had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. This war on the left and people of color led to unprecedented and ruthless incarceration in conditions more akin to concentration camps than institutions of reform. According to a 2018 study, the unemployment rate among people who were formerly incarcerated is 27%. This is higher than the total unemployment rate during any period in US history, including the Great Depression. Due to the difficulty in finding work, formerly incarcerated people often become or underhoused and are forced by their material conditions into antisocial behavior for survival. The recidivism rate in the United States is one of the highest in the world, a staggering 76.6%. Clearly, if just one conviction can make it incredibly hard to find work and thus proper shelter, then multiple convictions make it all but impossible. This condemns people to an undignified and traumatic life. By now, based on countless studies and plain common sense, it should be obvious that the solution to most antisocial behavior is to ensure basic human needs are met. Nutritious food, clean water, dignified shelter, and high-quality healthcare. Since the war on drugs had no intention of actually solving the problem, it not only locked up millions, but also created the largest surge of unhoused people since the Indian Removal Act. And this process is ongoing. Unhoused people are targeted by state authorities both legally and physically. A litany of laws including loitering, camping in parks or on sidewalks, and trespassing all seek to criminalize being unhoused. Police violence against the homeless has its own bloody history, but in short, it's rampant and savage. In Los Angeles County near the town of Lancaster, police have been rounding up unhoused people and dropping them in the Mojave Desert where summer temperatures average over 38 degrees Celsius, or over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. This is unconscionable and tantamount to attempted murder. While this particular horror is confined to just one county in California, there's another you've probably encountered if you've ever walked under an overpass, sat on a park bench, or waited at a bus stop in a US city. Unusable armrest on park benches, narrow and pitched bus stop seating, even large concrete spikes. It's called hostile or anti-homeless architecture, using the built environment to make the lives of the unhoused even more miserable by deterring or preventing them from using public infrastructure and amenities to sleep, escape the elements, or just relax. This liberal response to a systemic problem is not only cruel, but wastes money that could be used to provide unhoused people with the services and support they need to return to dignified housing. Another capitalist innovation in increasing the ranks of the reserve army of labor also began in the 70s, what finance wonks call securitization of debt. In plain English, this term means creating a new security, a financially tradable asset, by pooling other assets. In 1970, one such security, the now infamous mortgage-backed security, was created and then tipped the first domino on the long road to the 2008 financial crash. However, this debt securitization market didn't really take off until 1983, when Fannie Mae concocted the first collateralized mortgage obligations. For our purposes, what's important about this particular financial scheme is that it relies on subprime debt. Now, a house isn't just a place you live, it's been partially abstracted by capital entities into a purely financial asset. However, these assets didn't have the power to bring down the housing market because of a law passed in 1933 called the Glass-Steagall Act. Among other important reforms, the bill separated commercial banking from investment banking. This is important because, hypothetically speaking, suppose a bank could both write mortgages and trade securities. This would create an incentive to generate as many mortgages as possible so that they could be pooled and turned into tradable securities. In order to do that, more and more subprime mortgages would need to be issued, greatly reducing the quality of the debt by introducing large quantities of subprime debt. Eventually, the loans will be called and holders of this debt would go bankrupt. Thankfully, that couldn't happen while this part of the Glass-Steagall Act remained law. As liberal laws go, it's pretty solid. Surely no one would repeal it. So Bill Clinton repealed it, signing the Financial Services Modernization Act into law in 1999 and allowing banks to do both commercial and investment banking. Banking executives and other members of the 1% made incredible amounts of money. The true scale of it is difficult to convey. Unfortunately, the party bus hit a brick wall in September 2008 when Lehman Brothers, the fourth largest investment bank, filed for bankruptcy, with their holdings of over $600 billion in assets. This began a cascade through an already weak economy that greatly contributed to what we know today as the Great Recession. 6 million people lost their homes. As a result, unemployment, evictions, and homelessness again rose sharply since subprime mortgages were held by people in precarious financial situations. When capital fails, normal people pay. You want to know a cool fact? We could house every single homeless person in the country without building a single new home. Sounds pretty bad that we don't just do it, right? Well, what if I told you we could give each of them 24 homes? Earlier we mentioned there are over 650,000 unhoused people in the US. There are over 16 million vacant homes that could be utilized to eradicate the entire phenomenon of homelessness. Of all the many proposed solutions to homelessness, only a few are moral and address the actual material needs of the people. Unfortunately, most are liberal and seek to work within the capitalist system. And although they are doomed to fail, they are the only ideas allowed to be tried. Ideas like building more affordable housing, or voucher programs that are either failures outright or so limited in scope that they have no impact on the problem. And right now you probably expect me to talk about NIMBYs and YIMBYs, but that would be making the mistake of attributing causes of systemic problems to individuals. What matters is that we live under an amoral and callous system. It's a system that causes there to be an overabundance of homes that are unaffordable to the vast majority of the people, while human beings die of exposure on the streets just outside. But if there are so many vacant homes, why do we see so many articles from all around the US raising the alarm about housing shortages? The sensational, brief headlines obscure the fact that they're only talking about affordable housing. Why is there a lack of affordable housing? Homes are treated as a commodity instead of shelter, and as of 1970, also an asset to be bought and sold on the stock market. Additionally, the most profitable housing to build isn't affordable. So what results from a system where there's constantly increasing demand for a commodity, but you're only building the most profitable version of that commodity? The omniscient invisible hand dictates that the market should be flooded with high-end, unaffordable homes that then lie mostly vacant. In addition to an incentive to flood the market with a product most people can't afford, there's a perverse incentive for the capitalist class to ensure there are always a large number of unhoused people. Due to the unhinged morality inherent in the system, the unhoused are used as a threat against the rest of the working class. In Marxist terms, the and underhoused serve as a reserve army of labor that is primarily used by capitalists as a method of suppressing wages. After all, if there are a lot of unemployed people, high supply, then the price they can command in the market decreases, leading to a race to the bottom, where workers are forced to compete with one another over lower and lower wages. Since 2020, we've been living through yet another historic financial crisis caused by an abysmal response from the neoliberal establishment and capitalism's general fragility and inability to humanely handle crises. The resulting US death toll of over 1 million people is criminally negligent at best and a crime against humanity at worst. In addition, millions lost their jobs because their employers couldn't or wouldn't pay their employees to stay home. Like clockwork, layoffs and mass job loss led to even more people being unable to afford stable shelter. Eventually, the pandemic subsided, or more precisely, capital owners forced everyone to return to in-person work, despite the outrageous risk to public health. The economy has been mostly stagnant, while the media dutifully assures us that we're just about to turn the corner. However, according to numbers from the HUD's 2023 Annual Homelessness Assessment Report, it looks like the corner isn't even on the map. US homelessness reached a record high in 2023, increasing by 12% over the previous year to a staggering 653,000 people. According to the report, this is the highest number since reporting began in 2007. It strains even the most patriotic credulity to believe that the United States is anything but a decaying empire unwilling to care for its citizens in a manner that any reasonable and moral person would consider civilized. So, what's the solution? We need an immediate decommodification of housing, seizure of all housing stock, and distribution based on need, with mansions and similar properties either being leveled or turned into public accommodations. We need to develop a communal concept of housing, which would also entail learning to more adequately care for one another and move away from isolating and inefficient single-family housing. Few other aspects of capitalism lay out so starkly the utter inhumanity inherent to the system as homelessness. Under this system, profit is so much more important than people. To put it bluntly, inanimate dollar bills and gold bars have better housing conditions than 650,000 American citizens and most of the rest of the world. We have everything we need to solve this crisis, except the collective will. These analysis episodes are only possible thanks to our generous patrons. As a little thank you for your support, all patrons get early access to analysis episodes, as well as an audio version of the news. If you'd like to help support the show, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/firstthought. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.